I want to begin with a joke about being secular that tells us something about being religious. The comedian Woody Allen once quipped that he was dating a lapsed Catholic. He himself was a secular Jew. But in the end, the relationship foundered because they couldn't agree on which religion not to raise the children in. You see, there's a distinction between Christmas and Xmas. Many people talk about putting the Christ back in Christmas to make it a religious and church-focused event, as opposed to the more commercialized or the more home-based event that's around tree and family and decorations. Think of the difference between putting up a nativity scene in front of your house and putting up a Christmas tree or a Santa picture or image. There's an irony, of course, in the evolution of the tree, because the tree originally had nothing to do with Christianity at all. It was a pagan religious symbol of the winter solstice, and now it has become the symbol of a cultural identity that evolved out of a Christian religious tradition. In fact, even the celebrated atheist scientist Richard Dawkins still enjoys putting up a Christmas tree, but for him, it's a secular Xmas, not a Christ-filled Christmas. What I want to explore with you today briefly is how humanistic Judaism approaches Jewish religious tradition as an example of the power of a culturally rooted humanism. When you ask many Jews what makes you feel Jewish, the answers you receive are not belief in a God or dietary laws or ritual practices. For many Jews, their Jewishness is ethnic and cultural. So if being Jewish is really like being Irish or Korean, if it's defined by shared food and history and heritage and languages, a cultural identity, then a few consequences follow. First of all, like all cultures, Judaism was created by human beings, for human beings. It was a response to the human experience. But they also have, these elements of Jewish culture also have human origins. And if people made them, then we are allowed to criticize them, we are allowed to disagree with them, we are allowed to choose from them what we celebrate. And so the second corollary, which stems from that, is that like all cultures, Judaism itself has been and can be changed, adapted. It evolves like any living thing. Like all cultures, Judaism has similarity to other cultures, but also its own distinct features. It has a coming of age ceremony, it has a winter solstice event, it's a festival of lights, but that's not unique to Jews, of course, because of Christmas lights and Diwali lights and so on. Jewish culture values education, but so does Japanese culture and many other cultures around the world. I find that it's totally appropriate to mark one's culture as distinct, as different, even as having good features to it. There's something about having a healthy ego that we want our children to have, but they don't always have to go around claiming that they're the best at everything. Just like cultures that claim they're the best at everything strike us as more chauvinistic than as healthy egotism. I always laugh when someone gets me a number one dad card for Father's Day. How do you know? What's your data set? How have you compared me to any other fathers you've had in your life? How can you prove I'm the number one dad? But being a good father, you're a wonderful father. That's great. That's a scale I'm happy to live in. And so when we talk about Jewish culture, we are allowed to be distinct, different, unique, but we don't have to claim we're the best. And finally, like all evolving human cultures, there are many layers of meaning to any one particular observance or ceremony. Just like the Christmas tree evolved from its pagan roots to a Christian religious symbol to now a largely secular ceremony and celebration for many people of Christian heritage. The same is true for Passover, which we recently celebrated. It began as a harvest festival, harvesting the spring wheat and cleaning out the old wheat for farmers, and harvesting the spring lambs for shepherds. These later became combined into one holiday. You can see seams of that evolution even in the biblical text. And thus it became a festival of spring for both farmers and shepherds together at the same time. When there was one large temple and in Jerusalem that marked the sacrificial worship cult of the Hebrews from around 500 BCE and forward after that, we know for sure there was this kind of a temple. Before that, it may have been a very different kind of institution, some kind of a temple, but certainly not monotheistic for most of its life in that first temple period. So even the temple evolved, just to make the point. But when the temple stood in Jerusalem from 500 BC to about 70 of the Common Era, Passover was celebrated with major sacrifices. The offering of the paschal lamb was the major production, and the consuming of that lamb in one night, together with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, marked the ritual. When the temple was destroyed, and even before that, when Jews lived too far away to offer the sacrifices, new rituals began to develop, including the telling of the Exodus story, the reenactment by eating the meal with your staff in your hand and your clothes on, ready to leave. This retelling of the story becomes what we today call a Haggadah, from the same root lehagid, to tell a story. And ultimately, that parochial holiday of the Jews celebrating their liberation from slavery became a narrative that had universal significance. After all, everyone has their Egypt, whether it's an African American slavery or living in the old country and moving to America for freedom, or simply living in the strictures of one's parents' house and then finding freedom as one becomes older and lives on one's own. That narrative of from narrow places, Mitzrayim means narrow, tsar, into wide open spaces, the terror of freedom in the wilderness, but also the joy of finding one's own promised land. That's not confined to the Jewish people or the Jewish narrative. Thus is our approach to Judaism. When we study Jewish history, we find what's most meaningful and true out of the Jewish and the human experience, and we look at how we live every day to decide deep questions in life. When we try to solve problems, we rely on human power and knowledge. We want to understand the reality of life. We look to what we can learn, both as individuals and together with the collective pursuit of human knowledge. Thus, we are humanistic Jews. And in the face of an indifferent universe, which can involve viruses and plagues and other disasters, we know that the only source for improving that world is human power, human responsibility for ourselves and for each other, human knowledge and understanding that world, and deciding what to do and what is right and what is good based on the consequences for people and for the natural world. That's our source of ethics. So how does our humanism influence our Judaism? Well, humanism is our standard for how we relate to that broad inheritance of Jewish civilization. Imagine you've received your great aunt's attic, and there are some elements in that attic that are beautiful and marvelous. You want to take them down and display them in your home right away. And there may be some other parts of the attic that are old and musty and rotted, and you don't have any interest in it. Maybe someone else in the family wants to take them. And then there are also some elements in that attic that might work for you in your house, but they need a new frame, a new decoration, a new arrangement. It's all yours, that attic, all of those elements. But your house is still your house, and you still get to choose what goes in your house and how and why. We balance two values, and both of them are important. We want to have a sense of continuity with our ancestral tradition, our cultural inheritance, but we also want to have the integrity of living our values and saying what we believe and not saying and doing things that we don't believe. And so that has led to some changes in our educational program and the way we celebrate holidays, but after all, as we've seen, evolution and change is itself a Jewish tradition. And we also celebrate a deeply held Jewish tradition, that of Jewish integrity. There's a line in the Talmud that says, do not say one thing in the mouth and one thing in the heart. In other words, believe what you say, which is what we do. Now, does who I am affect my philosophy of life? Absolutely. It gives me a sense of rootedness and history, a sense of comfort in my own skin, a vocabulary and a calendar, and emotional resonance for the transition of seasons and the cycle of life. Does what I believe affect who I am? Of course it does. It inspires me to look beyond my own people's concerns and wisdom to find the truth and beauty to be found in other parts of the human family. This also motivates me to consider what I have received from my past in light of today's ideas and ideals to truly make it my own. If I can find a way to weave together who I am with what I believe, I can make a life of whole cloth. I can have roots and I can have wings. Everybody comes from somewhere. There's a reason why Esperanto was a tough lift and not a huge success. There are thousands of speakers even today, but people don't grow up speaking Esperanto to their children. They don't sing lullabies in Esperanto because it isn't what they heard as children. There are unique and beautiful elements of Jewish culture that would be lost or ignored if we were just a pure universal humanity. If it was just human culture, the diversity of distinct cultures might get lost. And all too often, those who trumpet a universal humanity, when they think of world music, don't think of Chinese or Japanese or African music. They think of European music. If we were just an orchestra of individual cultures and peoples, the Jewish people might be the piccolo, one of the smallest instruments in the orchestra. And if we played too loud, then we would ruin the entire flow. But if we play appropriately and distinctly in our own way, we can contribute to the harmony of all. And if we did not play our instrument, if there were no piccolo, something would be lost in the human orchestra. I sometimes hear objections from some secularized people. Why are you stuck on all this religious stuff from Jewish civilization? Why do you celebrate all these religious holidays? Why do you call it a congregation? Why do you call yourself a rabbi? I sometimes laugh when I'm called too religious because I know what I believe, I know how I live. I was raised to believe as a humanist. My parents are humanists. I'm a humanist now. I'm raising my children to be humanists. In the end, I have three basic responses to this question of why continue a religious heritage, even if one is not supernaturally religious. The first is that religious form is not the same as religious content. What do you call a Jewish leader who teaches, who organizes community, who provides philosophic counseling and pastoral support through difficult moments? A leader who officiates at ceremonies and holidays, who's an expert in Jewish history and identity? I mean, honestly, if that person walks like a rabbi and quacks like a rabbi, maybe you call them a rabbi. And there are some advantages provided by these traditional forms. Community support, the idea of having a leader who is kind of an intellectual counselor on retainer available to support you in those difficult moments or somebody to ask questions, things you don't understand. Having that rhythm of the seasons and the life cycle, knowing that whenever there's a full moon, it's the 15th of a Jewish month, and that connects us to the moon in ways that the ordinary calendar might not. And having that sense of emotional roots. If you have an heirloom menorah, there's no reason to melt it down or to sell it at a garage sale because you can use it with your family to give them memories just as you receive memories from your parents. Second answer to this question of why maintain these religious elements. The religious are not the only ones to have a claim on that inheritance. Yes, they are part of that great aunt's attic family too. But the Bible, the Talmud, the Hebrew language is mine also. It's mine to refashion and recreate, to choose from and adapt as I need. After all, if we believe the Bible was written by people, then it's literature. It's not just revelation. And it's all mine, even the parts I don't like. The flood story is a terrible story about how God messes up and then wipes out people to make up for it. But haven't we all had that impulse when we mess up something to just tear it up and start over again? It's a very human impulse, even if it's projected into a divine character. When I know Jewish holidays, Jewish literature, Jewish culture, I have literacy in my family's history, and I have the vocabulary of cultural roots to then use for my own creativity, which we'll see in just a moment. My third response to this challenge of sticking to religious elements is that if religion is a response to the human experience that shows up again and again in many cultures and times and places, then religion must be addressing human needs. Why am I here? Where did I come from? How can I go on through difficult moments? If humanists define themselves as responding to human needs, then we have to use religion as a resource to tell us what those needs are. And we need to then find our own answers to these very human needs that religion meets. After all, if we connect to Jewish culture, religion is simply a part of culture. It's not that it is another element, another existence beyond the cultural experience. Holidays, life cycle events, rituals, those are part of particular ethnic and religious cultures. So when we humanistic Jews celebrate Passover, we can tell the story of the Exodus as a story, and we can explore how it is a meaningful story, even if it is not historical. We can also celebrate the human experience of leaving restriction for freedom, be that migrating to the United States, as many of our ancestors did, or working to make the United States a more perfect union that lives up to its updated creed of all people being created equal or existing equally. And most importantly, when we celebrate Passover, we celebrate the evolution of the holiday with foods and songs and questions and answers and old meanings and new meanings. Sometimes when I meet with wedding couples, where one couple is from a Jewish background and one is from a not Jewish background, they are trying to avoid the stress of combining distinct traditions. And they want none of the above, no Hebrew and no elements of the other partner's culture. And I'm willing to do what they choose to do, but I find that that kind of ceremony is kind of blah, you know? Why just do pancakes when you can have fusion cuisine of two radically different cultures? Why not find ways to celebrate both of those cultures in your own way, consistent with your own values? There's an important side of knowing who you are, and you don't lose who you are when you marry someone from a different background. I want to conclude this remarks with a short poem by the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai. Elsewhere in our service this morning, we had another poem by him that really speaks to this idea of the needs religion answers, even for a secular age. And I find what is remarkable about this poem is that it draws inspiration from the human experience and articulated it originally in Hebrew. I'll read an English translation. But the imagery he uses is drawn directly from Jewish culture. And so this poem, My Head, gives us the pleasure of Jewish roots and the inspiration of human insight and wisdom. When my head got banged on the door, I screamed, my head, and I screamed, door, door. And I did not scream mother, and not God, nor did I speak of a vision of the end of days, of a world where there will be no heads and doors anymore. When you stroked my head, I whispered, my head, and I whispered, your hand, your hand. And I did not whisper mother, and not God, and I did not see wonderful visions of hands stroking heads in the opening heavens. Whatever I scream and speak and whisper is to comfort myself. My head, door, door, your hand, your hand. There we have the subjectivity of the individual experience of my head, the harsh reality of the world, the door on which it bangs, and the comfort we derive from each other through the medium of your hand.